Okay. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to week 5. We got students and visitors here. Welcome. So does anybody have any questions about the course, your projects? I'm going to be talking about our field trip on Thursday. I'm also going to be talking about presentations a week from Thursday. So if there's anything that is unclear, it's probably my fault, so just let me know and I'll clear that up for you. We have the slide again. So again, I want to remind you to sign in. If you're a student, on the attendance form, there's a Meet with Dave sign-up sheet. If you're a team that hasn't met with me, this would be a great week to do it because next week you're going to be preparing for your presentations, and I can help you with that part of the. I can help you with your presentations and your project. Just a reminder for people that are community members that are new, there's no cell phone or laptop use during the class. There will be a break time where you can use those devices. Okay. Somebody asked a question about Yahoo and Oath, and this is the definitive response. Yahoo is now a part of Oath, digital and mobile media company. They have lots of companies underneath them, including HuffPost, Engadget, TechCrunch, Moviefone, and Makers, and they are all under the umbrella of Verizon. Okay, so sounds like a big company. So last week I asked people about their employment choices, and here's the results. Looks like Google wins, with Apple not far behind. A lot of write-in. Some of these companies are in the prosthetics and orthotics field. Others are medical field. So it's good to hear that you have a plan to work with one of these companies. So upcoming class sessions, Thursday, we're going to not meet in here, but we're going to meet outside and go to the VA Medical Center, which is just down the road. And a week from Thursday are the midterm presentations in the classroom. And later on this month will be the Assistive Technology Fair, which may prove to be a big event. So stand by for that. So the field trip this Thursday, this is the VA Medical Center. So we're going to learn about the VA and the Palo Alto VA from a clinician who is in the spinal cord injury service. We're going to also learn about brain injury. There'll be people there from recreational therapy to tell you about what they do. We'll also hopefully hear from a veteran with a disability to get their perspective. And in addition, and most fun for you would be trying out equipment like wheelchairs and these hand-powered bicycles. So the plan is to carpool and meet there around 4:45, and here's some of the instructions. Okay, so in previous lectures, the drivers have signed up and the passengers have signed up, and I think there's just a couple students who haven't signed the form, so I'm going to pass this around to sign up with a driver, and then all the students will be accounted for. I'll be sending drivers and passengers a reminder about what car they're in and who the people in the car are, and a map of everything, so everybody will be able to get there and nobody will get lost. So next Thursday, instead of coming to class, we meet at 4:30, just on the other side of the Littlefield Center building where the Star is. That's an easy access for cars. And so if you're a driver, pick up your car first and then meet your passengers at that location. Passengers, get there and match up with your drivers, and then be off as soon as you can. So I want everybody to make their best effort to be there on time, because the VA is a great place to be, and we don't want to waste any time with that. So Here's where we're going. The VA is just inches away on the map from Stanford, just down the road. And here's how we're going to get there. So from where the Littlefield is, it's easy to get on Palm Drive, go to El Camino Real, make a right turn on Page Mill, make a left turn on Foothill Expressway, which is this street, and make a left turn at Hillview and a right turn on Miranda, and you'll find yourself going in this direction, and you turn into the VA campus where the big American flag is. You can't miss it. And then park on the right at in this parking lot. And the building that we're going into is just off the parking lot where that star is. That's called Building 7, Spinal Cord Injury, and we'll meet in a room just inside there. I'll be sending this map to everybody, so you can refer to it if you're forgetful. Here's another view of it. Go in the main entrance, park in that parking lot, and there's Building 7, and the star at the corner of the building is where you want to go in. You really don't want to go in the middle of the building because you'll have to walk down the corridor with rooms and stuff. So we'll be meeting in what's called the day room, and Dr. Creasy will greet us there. Okay, get another map. The star is where you want to go. Okay, everybody clear on what to do on Thursday? Okay, great. Yes?
When should we expect to be back?
Well, if you can, as long as you stay there, you can stay there as long as you want. But if you have to leave early, make sure you make arrangements with your driver, or maybe another driver who's leaving early as well. But I don't know about traffic at that hour, so I can't tell you when to leave to be back at a particular time. But so I appreciate you staying as long as you can. Okay, and I understand if you have to leave early. So just make those arrangements beforehand. Again, I want to remind you every week to work with diligence, work every week on your project. If you don't work every week, it's going to show up in your presentation and report. So you want to put effort into that. So this week you should be working with your team, working with your user, and getting the information you need to make some low-resolution prototypes and do a great presentation on next Thursday. Yes?
Could you give some examples of low-resolution?
Anything that doesn't cost a lot, like foam core, cardboard, paper. I had the best example I can give you is that there's one team who was working on a walker. So his low-resolution prototype is that he cut apart pencils and hot melted them together for the first prototype. So there's a team working over here with Angie on the elevator button pusher project, and so they've done a lot of stuff with prototypes, which was different kinds and lengths of wood and metal and clay and stuff like that. So it's important to start out early and realize that your first prototypes are going to be throwaway, but you're going to be learning from them. So it's important to have it in physical form so that your brain, which works in 3D, and your fingers can touch things and you can look at things and turn it over and get a much better idea of how to proceed. If you just worked on one prototype from beginning to end, it would not work at all. Okay, so it's important to do as many prototypes as you can, which means you should do them quickly. I mean, like 10 minutes, a half an hour, no more than that. It would be a mistake to say, for you to work on a CAD drawing to make a low-resolution prototype, because it may take hours to do that CAD drawing, but if you just slap something together, that would be fine. Okay. It's really important for your presentation to be concise because you're only getting 7 minutes, and that's going to seem way too short for you. So you really have to work hard on cutting it down to just the essentials. So that may mean what can help you out there is if you have a picture or a short video, so you don't have to explain things in words. Showing a picture may be all you need, and maybe just one sentence talking about, some of the prototypes you worked on. Okay. This may be the hardest thing you've done at Stanford, to have a short, concise, excellent presentation, and it's well worth the practice and the time that goes into it. Okay. Okay. So I just want to do a little bit about some assistive technology projects that I've seen recently, and here's one by a former student who's blind, who worked with the class for several years.
So how I work on my phone, use a keyboard, is I have to somehow find the alphabet on the touchscreen and then double tap it if I actually want to type it out. It takes up a lot of time. And so I only use that phone if I actually have to.
Cortex never say diarrhea with an inspiration to think. Just like in many blind users use their smartphones to very easily consume content, like reading emails and games. However, creating content on smartphones, specifically typing, is hard. For me, if I can't type on my smartphone, I can't keep up with my friends, or even be productive at work. Technology is not supposed to build directly, but instead, level the playing field. Which is why we created Just Type.
H-E-L-L-C. Hello space.
Just Type is a keyboard which allows anyone to type on a smartphone regardless of their visual abilities. It's a very simple system with two keys, one on the left and one on the right. Any right swipe on the left side is always a A. The down swipe is always a B. Next swipe is always a C. Up is always a D. One tap is a E. And double tap is a D. The exact same six gestures are mapped to alphabets G to L on the right side. Now if I hold my right hand down, the left side switches to the next six alphabets, and if I hold my left thumb down, I get 6 more. Y and Z are two thumbs, left and right swipe. Numbers and symbols are also very easy to switch. Plus, once you get used to the keyboard, its smart algorithm allows you to type very fast without needing to hold the thumb down and switch it.
H-E-L-L-C. Hello space. Hello, this is keyboard.
I've used Just Type Beta, and I think it makes typing a lot easier and faster. I can see myself using my phone much more often, and the frustration that I had before, I see that going away now.
Over the past many months, we have tested Just Type with several users and have great feedback. We are very close to releasing the app in the App Store, but it still needs performance and algorithm upgrades. Plus, we need to build training materials and raise awareness. And for that, we need your help. So come on board and let's make this happen.
All right. So obviously this is useful for blind and vision impaired people, so they can use their smartphone without having to figure out where the letters are. And it can also help students who want to text in class without the instructor knowing about it. So that's great. So this is a interesting custom K9 wheelchair. So this is for dogs who need support for their back legs, and so it's an assistive technology, not for people but for animals, for dogs, and it's not coming up otherwise. So the neat thing about this is they have step-by-step directions on how to do this at home for your pet. So you don't have to buy this anyplace. You can make it yourself. It's out of low-cost parts, and you can just put it together at home. Well, I guess some of these parts are 3D printed. So this is an example of a do-it-yourself type project that you can work on. And let's see the next one. So more student projects. This is a SnackBot. It's robots that can deliver food in 15 minutes or less. And think of how this would benefit not only students on campus, but people with disabilities too, who may not have time or the ability to make their own food. So you can just order it and the robot comes, and so in that sense it's assistive technology as well. So it has artificial intelligence, ultrasonic sensors, cameras and stuff. And I've seen delivery vehicles like this being tested in downtown Palo Alto, but they made a food service version of this. Okay. This is, I alluded to the Stanford Center on Longevity. They hold a design challenge every year, and this is a video explaining the challenge. I think they've selected the finalists for this year, and they're going to be coming on campus in April.
Design Challenge is something that we started primarily to try to get more young designers interested in the area of longevity. I'm Ken Smith. I work at the Stanford Center on Longevity, where I direct the center's design challenge as well as the mobility division. So when the finalists actually come to Stanford, it's actually a 3-day process. The first day, we get a chance to experience a little bit about Stanford and Silicon Valley. So this year, we worked with a group called the Longevity Explorers, and we built a workshop around the question of what is different about designing for an 85-year-old than a 25-year-old. We then followed that with a tour of Stanford from a designer's perspective. So we talked about
These are students from all over the world.
architecture, design thinking process, and how that was generated at Stanford. And they ended up at the school where we talked about that. Afternoon, we got on a bus and we went over to IDEO, the world's leading design consulting firm. And the next day they come in for the actual finals, which I've described as, coming in and getting essentially a Silicon Valley pitch. 7 minutes to present their design.
See, they get 7 minutes too.
The judges all very strictly controlled so that they learn how to get their ideas across concisely.
We match the retirees to busy dog owners to help them walk their dog.
Grow and Gather is a burden station that's a versatile and mobile burden station.
Seven Bridges, an intergenerational community centered around activities of daily living.
Posture Master.
40% of the story is around the impact of design, how much change it has to make the world. 30% is around originality, 20% is feasibility. The lowest number is actually cost, which is 10% of the score. A fifth criteria that kind of sits over the top of the other four, which is the alignment with the challenge. So after we do the finals and we award the prizes, they come back for a third day where we host a workshop jointly with the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, specifically the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. They learn a little bit about how to create a product plan. They learn a little about some of the legal issues. And we also have some talks from investors who will talk about how do you go about finding money and is your product or service right for an angel investor or an incubator or perhaps something you might want to sell to someone.
Okay. It's very interesting, this second paragraph here. This year's competition included a new rule. Students were required to work with members of the community on their projects. So no more just thinking about it yourself and coming up with something. You actually had to work with real users. So it's funny, it took them 5 years to realize that. So as you recall from last week, Sha Yao, remember her presentation by video? She was the first winner of this design competition. I think she might be the only one who's brought her product to commercialization. Toyota is actually getting into assistive technology. I don't know if you're aware, but there's a place called the Toyota Research Institute on El Camino near San Antonio, and they work on a whole variety of things, including assistive technology stuff. So they're envisioning a human support robot that would care for somebody in their home. And I was just wondering, how this might work, because it doesn't seem to me that a robot could be the one thing that would help you with everything. So we'll see how well that they do. They said, ready for deployment in hospitals and rest homes to perform simple tasks in 3 years. So start your countdown. there's been a lot of effort in this area over the years in different countries, and none of them really have amounted to anything. So it'd be interesting to see what success Toyota Research Institute has. So like I said, on Thursday, we're going to go to the VA Palo Alto healthcare system, and our host will be Dr. Graham Creasy, who's been a long time member of the Spinal Cord Injury Service staff, and he'll tell us about the VA, the Palo Alto VA, and all the good work that is done in the spinal cord injury ward. Okay. So after our break, we'll hear from Dr. Lindsay Felt, who's right there. So we'll take a break while we set up for her presentation. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, you can actually plug. There's an AC outlet. There's an AC outlet over there too.
Okay.
Oops.
Do you have the connection for Clicker?
For what?
For Clicker?
Oh yeah, I have
Okay,
this.
so we'll get that.
Hold on.
I might go straight from there to if that's the case,
This is a fancy tech setup.
Yeah.
Can we figure that out?
that's why I was yeah, so she, and then if that was
I know that's a really bulky surgery.
oh, imagine because I know I'm not gonna get anything because I'm just kind of like chilling. He hasn't.
This one right there.
Yes. HDMI.
Oh, okay, I can do that.
How'd you like? You want to join us?
I want to ask. I was going to ask, I remember last time I opened it up for questions pretty early. Would you advise against doing that again?
Well, it's hard to tell how many questions there's going to
I know.
be, but I will ask a couple questions.
Okay, I think that's just sort of my presenting mood, which
Yeah.
is to essentially.
So plug that in.
10 hours. Yeah, so we can't wait 1 week.
A lot of people in the first class.
Really, the left of chicken.
So that's why it's understandable.
Would it be this one?
I don't know.
There are a whole bunch. I don't have my own phone, but there are a whole bunch on.
Or in laptop, but they're off. So there's only 1 or 2 here. And then there are 2 in the
6 free ones on campus.
Like this.
I can do it manually.
Okay.
You can command me to.
Okay, yeah, that wouldn't, I feel bad, but,
Yeah.
well, sort of. I meant to ask
so this particular slide is I'm gonna sort of go through some examples pretty quickly. So you can just populate that, and then you've got the demo
just by listening.
The listening demo of what the cochlear implant sounds like here,
Okay,
those will be
click
the
there.
hyperlinked. But we'll see how we go. I might ask you to just skip over some examples depending
Okay.
on how we're doing.
Okay. I'm going to give you the wireless mic.
Okay.
So, are you ready?
I might just do a quick refill of the water fountain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'll wait.
Is this for, would it be okay to do the,
Yeah.
maybe I'll do this.
It's a clip there.
And then this is being videotaped. I actually asked because some of my colleagues were interested in being.
Okay. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And I'll send you the link.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, ready?
Yes,
I'm gonna
whenever you're
introduce-
ready.
Okay. I have to use the mic.
Okay.
Chloe?
Would you recommend? I'm assuming that roving is probably not going to work for the
No,
video
she'll
camera.
follow you.
Okay.
You ready? Okay. Okay, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lindsay Felt. She's a postdoctorate lecturer.
No, just a lecturer now.
Yeah,
Not
I
a
said
postdoc.
Oh, okay, lecturer. Okay. In the program for writing and rhetoric here at Stanford, she received her PhD in English from Stanford in 2016 and holds a BA from Haverford College. Before coming to Stanford, she was a journalist for ESPN, the magazine, and ESPN, the website. Her research interests include contemporary American literature, media culture, science fiction, right, science and technology studies, and disability studies. She's currently researching how disabled bodies crucially shape conceptions of electronic communication in the post-World War II era, and has written articles on female hackers in cyberpunk fiction and the little-known history of the first cybernetic limb and its influence on communication engineering in the early Cold War era. Her course in the program for writing and rhetoric, Unruly Bodies, Gesturing Toward a New Rhetoric of Body Language, explores how advances in science, technology, medicine, and culture have transformed our understanding of disability, normalcy, and health. So let's welcome Lindsay Felt.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to David for this invitation to speak to all of you today. I've been really looking forward to this talk for quite some time. Before I begin, I just wanted to apologize in advance. I am coming off of 2 back-to-back classes, so I may be losing my voice just a little bit. So please bear with me on that. And I also wanted to say that I invite you guys to ask questions at any point during my presentation if you wanted clarification or just wanted to throw out a comment. I really believe in making transparent my experience as a user of assistive technology, specifically relating to deaf and hard of hearing assistive technologies used for that particular population. So I thought I would begin with a story. So I was about in maybe third or fourth grade, and I had a teacher named Mr. Bowman. And at that time, I used to wear hearing aids. And I had my teacher, Mr. Bowman, wear what is called an FM system. And this is a particular device that hard of hearing individuals use, specifically in an educational setting. And so he would wear this FM system, and it essentially would wirelessly transmit and amplify sound directly into my hearing aid. So it was great for noisy environments. It would kind of amplify or shine sort of an auditory spotlight on his voice. So we would wear this every day. And one day, he happened to go to the restroom with his FM system. And all of a sudden, I heard some rustling, maybe a little bit of water splashing, and then the sound of flush. And I was like, I turned to my girlfriend and I was like, I think Mr. Bowman is using the restroom. I can hear everything. And we had a good laugh about that. And the point being of this story, why am I beginning with this story, is that there are possibilities that we don't necessarily think of with assistive technology. In that particular moment, I had better hearing than my classmates. I had essentially X-ray hearing. I could hear through the walls that my classmates did not. But there's also some funny moments that emerge out of assistive technology too. The moments when you have sort of a mismatch of expectations. So I just thought I would begin with this story, and there will be other stories to come. So as you may have gleaned from this story, I am deaf, but I also wear cochlear implants, so I have two. So I am what you would call a bilateral cochlear implant user. So these two identities, deafness and my use of cochlear implants, actually coexist. And I think most people would find that quite surprising. How can one still be deaf if they have a cochlear implant? But I would argue that most users would say they're inextricably linked. So when David asked me to speak to you today, I decided to focus on cochlear implants in the context of assistive technology, but also as a way of framing future discussions of assistive technology. So cochlear implants are about one of the many forms of assistive technology that I have used personally. It was developed over 45 years ago as a medical intervention in which surgeons implanted a string of electrodes. So you can see here in this image, on the left is the internal device that goes inside the ear, and on the right is the external device. My devices do not look quite like this one. There's a couple of different variations and products on the market. But effectively, what this technology allows is for direct intervention into the user's ear that would allow for a fuller range of frequencies to be heard. So in my lifetime, I have used a range of devices from hearing aids. So I think you can skip to the next one. So hearing aids, FM systems, telecommunication systems for the deaf, such as the TTY. And then, so you can see there's actually a contrast between two different ones. The one on the top is a more modern TTY. The one on the bottom is, I think, outs itself as a more sort of anachronistic technology. My parents actually bought me the one on the bottom when I was younger, and I thought it was the coolest high-tech thing I had ever seen, but it turns out that it was actually pretty clunky. And now, as you can imagine, TTYs are actually outdated. They've been essentially almost rendered obsolete by the use of text messaging and video conferencing, at least for those who use this technology in the deaf community. I also have used technologies such as vibrating alarm clocks and flashing lights. So the device in the center there is something that I actually use today, and it goes in my pillow, and it's actually a baby monitor, and it can particularly pick up the cries of a baby, not talking, cries of a baby. And it is really effective for me, although I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with this because at times the battery dies and I am not aware of that. And so I have maybe unintentionally sleep trained my son, who is now 3, so he just would cry through the night. I didn't hear a thing, I didn't wake up, and she was happy in the morning, but he may have had a bit of a traumatic night. Okay, but here's the interesting thing. In a way, the cochlear implant has now become kind of a universal device that can do all of these things. Can I get the next slide? Thank you. So it comes packaged with mobile technology software, internal communication switching devices, so I have the ability to flip a switch that wirelessly tunes into my telephone, or my cell phone, in other words. So we are essentially on the same wavelength or communication field. I can rotate between different programs that allow me to zoom in to particular sounds. So if I'm in a noisy restaurant, I can hone in to a particular person that's speaking or a particular direction. So there's actually quite a few capabilities. There's already kind of an FM system built in. Yeah, quick question?
How do you do that? Do you have to use a device with your phone, or is there a way in the future where you could like look somewhere and then like to a specific person?
Yeah.
And then how does it take away the other sound to identify that one thing that you're looking for?
Yeah, so great question. So what you see here on the screen are 2 different devices. One is actually a remote control. So the cochlear implant comes with a remote control. And the idea is that I could rip out that remote control, hit the program. So I can carry 4 programs in my implant. And I can hit one program that my audiologist and I have worked on that's specifically for noisy devices, noisy environments. And there's an algorithm program that somehow there's a smart computer inside my implant that it allows it to identify based on the directionality of who or what I'm facing that pulls in that particular sound. But they have advanced now. The newer devices allow you to synchronize with your phone, your iPhone, in other words. So that's what you're seeing on the right here. So I can change my volume, I can change my program. I have the ability to do it directly from my implant itself, but it requires a lot of button pushing and toggling through the programs, and it can be a little bit awkward to be in the middle of a conversation kind of going like this. I personally have not been in favor of the remote control just because we all carry enough devices around as it is, and I'm switching between backpacks, purses, and different bags, and so I find that if I were dependent on that particular remote control, I would be sort of tied to that if I didn't have it with me. So I tend to sort of stay with I'm a one program kind of gal myself, although I think my audiologist would sort of suggest me to experiment a little bit more. Any other questions at this moment? Okay, so I've sort of sketched out a brief introduction of the cochlear implant. What I wanted to ask today is, instead of asking why do I need this device, I wanted to reframe this question outside of a medical deficit model, which is, why do I want, or why do I decide to use this device on a daily basis? Okay, so I wanted to begin by sharing my story, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more, as a framework for today's lecture in order to suggest that the cochlear implant can disrupt our notions of what functions or purposes assistive technology should serve. So the perspective I'm offering today is a personal one, but it's also one from the perspective of a literary scholar who has spent several years studying the discourse around technology and people with disabilities. Okay, the other area of research that I've been working on that I did want to introduce very briefly to you is this idea of disability studies, and maybe you've mentioned this or discussed this, I'm not sure, at any point in your class. But but disability studies is an interdisciplinary academic field of inquiry that exposes how disabled bodies and minds are constructed through environmental barriers to access. So in other words, it's moving away from a medical deficit model, this idea that a person with a disability should be cured or fixed or normalized, but tries to open up a more expansive understanding of disability as something that is socially constructed or that is a product of environmental barriers. So that's a really important takeaway that I wanted to leave you with today. So I thought, before I move into the sort of more formal lecture or talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about my experience with the cochlear implant. So I have been profoundly deaf since the age of 4. The clinical definition of a profound hearing loss is a level of hearing loss in which a person cannot hear unless it is 90 decibels loud or louder. Can anyone tell me what makes a sound that is 90 decibels or louder? Any idea? It would help if you raise your hand so I can find it. Okay, hi. A lawnmower, yeah, exactly right. Any other examples? Okay, thank you.
Really loud, like an iPod, all the way up.
A little what?
Like a loud iPod.
iPod? That might not be quite as loud, but that's probably a good guess. So a lawnmower or a motorcycle essentially right next to you. That's really freaking loud, okay? So essentially what that means is if I am not wearing any auditory devices, the only thing I can hear is a lawnmower if I was standing right next to it, or a motorcycle if I was standing right next to it. For most people, that would be a really uncomfortable experience. So I have what is called a profound hearing loss, and that is categorized as the most significant hearing loss on the spectrum, which means that listening and comprehension is not even really difficult, but pretty much impossible without any sort of assistive device or technology. So to put it in quantitative terms, at least in terms of my audiologist's assessment, I have lost roughly 97% of my hearing. So as someone who lives with a profound hearing loss, I move fluidly between the world of silence and sound or noise. So my cochlear implants bring the world of sound alive for me at the switch of a button. All it takes for me is to put them on in the morning, and I'll explain a little bit more about how it works, turn the on button, and then the world sort of turns into a rainbow of sound. But it's also like having a remote control that can mute the world at a whim. So when I don't want to listen to something, I can just turn my implant off. So one example I'll give is my husband is a Phish fan. They're a jam band, in case you haven't heard of them. I have somewhat mixed feelings about the band. So when she wants to blast it on the stereo at home, I can just turn my implant off, type on my computer, and she can just rock out. So there are some benefits to being able to turn the world of sound off. So that's what I like to consider my superpower. But there are also many times when it's not a benefit. When a battery dies in the middle of a class lecture, that's happened more often than I would like to admit. And I just have to proceed on, either in silence or with just one ear active. So, throughout the better part of my childhood and adolescence, I was an avid hearing aid user, and I was mainstreamed into hearing schools. So this made me an excellent potential candidate to be a cochlear implant recipient, because I had performed well already with hearing aids or other assistive amplification devices, and I had also learned to adapt my lifestyle around that. And that's really important in considering candidacy for a cochlear implant, because it actually takes quite a bit of work to essentially get up to speed and to get some sort of user utility out of the device. There are many stories of people who either get frustrated or they don't put in the work that it takes to get your brain to adjust to this new way of hearing, and oftentimes they can't get over that initial barrier, which can be unfortunate because it's a very expensive and invasive procedure, but it's also something that doesn't always work for everybody. Okay, so I waited until I was about 18 years old until I received my first implant. Now, by today's standard, that's actually quite late. We have babies around 6 months old getting implanted now, so intervention is very, very early, and that tends to be the protocol and the standard now. But for me, because I did so well with hearing aids on both sides, I was able to sort of hold off on that. And the benefits of waiting is that it actually became my decision versus my parents' decision or the decision of other medical practitioners. So I received my first cochlear implant in 2002, and I waited a little over 10 years to get my second one, which is also kind of unusual. So what I can hear since then has changed dramatically. My brain has adapted to these new technologies, and every software upgrade and device upgrade, I've gone through about 5 different external devices since I've had them. The internal devices have remained the same because that requires surgical intervention, but 5 different external devices, that's about essentially an iPhone every 2 to 3 years, except for a medical device attached to my body every 2 to 3 years. So you can imagine it takes a little bit of time to get used to a new device, right? There's a lag or a period in which one has to adapt. It's not quite as easy as, oh, what new program do I have on my phone? Let me check out this new camera. Okay, so I think that's just enough about me. One thing that I'll also note is that even though, and I should say that my cochlear implant, when I have been tested with the cochlear implant, both of them in an auditory booth, I've been tested at 90% comprehension. Now, if you think about the 97% profound hearing loss, only being able to hear lawnmowers and not even being able to hear human speech or music, 97% comprehension of human language is a pretty incredible statistic. I should note that that test is done in a carefully curated environment, a booth in the audiologist's office, and so that's not necessarily a test of what it would be like to hear in the real world. And then the second thing that I'll also add is at the end of the day, when I take my cochlear implants off, I can't hear. And so it does not cure or fix me. Merely it serves as a vehicle for me to communicate on a regular basis and when I need it. So I think that's a really important takeaway. I think oftentimes people think of users of cochlear implants as being cured or fixed, but that really isn't quite the case. So I'll just stop for a minute and just ask if there are any questions or comments at this point in time. Yeah.
So what does it sound like when you get
A new device? I think it really changes for each device. There's definitely continuity. It's not like it sounds so different that I'm starting from scratch. But each program is different, and it takes me anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks to really feel like I'm up to speed. Sounds are a little bit different, words sound a little bit different. I have to sort of recatalog what I'm hearing in my brain. So a lawnmower might not sound exactly like a lawnmower. An airplane might not sound exactly like an airplane. So I have to sort of recatalog them, and that can be a time-consuming process. Some maps or some devices are much more seamless. It also depends on how dramatically the company that produces my implant has changed their software or the device itself. So there's sort of 2 different levels. The software can change, but the device itself can also change. So I'm actually going to go into my audiologist's office in a few weeks, and I'm going to get 2 brand new devices on both sides, and they're both going to be, I think they're both going to be the same, but I actually have a choice for the first time ever about which device I can get, and I'll say a little bit about which devices those are. So that's kind of an exciting opportunity. Yeah. So to be sure I heard you correctly, how selective or how can I negotiate the outside sounds or external sounds with individual speakers? How do I have a comparison or a framework?
Like for example, even though you have the equalizer, how do you know how a lawnmower is supposed to sound?
Okay, so that's a really great question, and I actually have a demo later that will show you what it sounds like at first, because it sounds really unnatural, and what it sounds like for a listener who's been listening for a long time. The first time I started listening with a cochlear implant, it sounded robotic, harsh. It did not sound natural. That's the best I can describe it. But over time, the amazing plasticity of the brain allows you to sort of smooth out the sound, and it actually becomes naturalized. Now, again, my frame of reference for that is a little bit different than yours, but I can take pleasure and delight in what I hear. It feels comfortable. So the brain can make it sound more natural, or sort of interpret it as natural, even though the input that I'm getting is artificial. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
So what kind of are the effective differences between using a hearing aid and a cochlear implant, and then what is the difference in price associated with these?
Okay, so a hearing aid is a device that only amplifies whatever existing hearing you have, and a cochlear implant actually it actually is known to, and I'll get into this a little bit later in my talk, but it gives you the whole range of frequencies. So it essentially kind of creates sound from scratch through the electrodes. So to give you an example, with my hearing aids, I could only hear low frequency sounds. I could not hear high frequency sounds. So only the low frequency sounds were amplified. I never had access to high frequency sounds like crickets, for example. But when I got my cochlear implant, I was given that whole range of frequencies was available to me. So it's a pretty dramatic difference. Okay, how about at this point we'll move forward, because I think some of these questions will be answered. It's taking me a long time to get to the overview, so I'll have to keep an eye on the time. But I've already shared a little bit about my personal experience, but I also wanted to give some historical background of the cochlear implant, as well as a more detailed explanation of how it works. And then, if we have time, which may be unlikely, I wanted to discuss a writer named Michael Kors, and also a historian of science and technology named Mara Mills, who introduced us two different ways of understanding the cochlear implant. As a machine for music appreciation, that might be kind of surprising, or as a machine for language processing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of rhetoric that often get ascribed to the cochlear implant within different communities. And then finally, I want to use the cochlear implant as a way to think about the possible future directions of assistive technology. Okay, so that's our plan. Okay, so how does a cochlear implant work? So as you can see from this diagram, and as I showed in a previous diagram, there are two different components. One component is the internal device, which you can see here. That is fully internalized, and there's a magnet, essentially, or a transmitter component that sits underneath the scalp, and then there's a very small set of electrodes that get threaded through the cochlea, which is this spiral, snail-shaped structure in your inner ear. And so that requires a surgical procedure from a highly trained surgeon who oftentimes specializes in this. The procedure itself has improved dramatically. It's shortened in scope. To give you an example, the first procedure in 2002 took over an hour, or took a couple hours, and the recovery time was over a month. So I could not do anything with that ear. I was not able to activate that ear for a month while the inner ear and the external part healed. The second time around, the surgery was maybe under an hour, and I just had to wait for 2 weeks to heal until I could go into my audiologist's office to get activated. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means too. So you have the internal device, which is only implanted through surgical intervention, and then you have the external device, which is called the external processor, and that, so as you can see, I wish I had my laser pointer with me, but you have a magnet that sits on top of the scalp, and that is what allows the sound to be transmitted directly through the internal component. And then the device that sits behind the ear is essentially a microprocessor, and so that's where all the computing power resides in the device. So the algorithms that I talked about, the ability to convert sound from the microphone into electrical signals that then travel through the magnet and then the internal processor. A really large part of this external device is also the battery. The battery is the biggest part of this processor. It has shrunk quite a bit over the years, but you have two options with the battery. You can have a rechargeable battery, which I use because it's more environmentally friendly, or you can use disposable batteries, which actually have a longer battery life. So the battery actually oftentimes tends to be the bottom portion of the implant and the heaviest part of the implant as well. Okay, so before I get into that, maybe we can go back one. I also just wanted to say, so once the implantation happens, I mentioned that there's a recovery period, but then there's an activation period. So what that looks like is the user will often go into an audiologist's office and they have a specific program on their computer and they hook you up with a device to your implant that syncs with the computer, and they essentially map out 24 electrodes, 22 to 24 depending on your device, and they take the minimum threshold so that you can barely discern but you think you're hearing, and the maximum threshold that is almost uncomfortably loud, and they do this for each of the individual electrodes. So there's 24 of these. So this takes quite a bit of time. You can imagine it's kind of an overwhelming experience for the first time. You're not exactly sure what you're hearing or rather feeling. And then the audiologist will turn on, they'll do some toggling. They have a visual map in front of them, and they will turn on all the frequencies at once. I can't really describe the experience of the very first time I was activated. It was more of a feeling rather than a sound, and it's pretty overwhelming. There's a whole YouTube genre of people getting activated who just break down crying, or their family members sit there and watch. And it's like, it's very sweet, but it's also maybe a little bit comical too, because the responses are just so profoundly emotional. So it's quite an experience, I'll say. Any questions thus far about how the cochlear implant works? Okay. So cochlear implants in a nutshell, they've been around for some time, but it's really amazing how far they've come. So in 1925, a handful of radio enthusiasts reported hearing sounds when they held electrodes to their ears. So this was the Weaver-Bray experiment, which introduced this idea that what if a telephone circuit could connect the nerve and the machine? So it used the inner ear as a model for a kind of like contemporary transmitter, converting sound waves into electrical currents, which carry to the brain rather than being rather than residing simply in the cochlea. So it understood the cochlea as an electromechanical system capable of turning electrical waves into mechanical ones. So that was sort of the foundation of thinking about the cochlear implant. So you can see some really early instances of the device. The first one was a single channel cochlear implant, and that was in 1972. So I believe that's probably not even the one on the top. But in other words, it just targeted one frequency. So we have 24 today. The first user only had one frequency. That's not a very rich experience of sound, but it was still a major leap forward. In 1982, Graham Clark, an Australian, was hailed as the inventor of the modern cochlear implant. She invented the multi-channel cochlear implant. And essentially, Graham Clark's product became actually what I wear today. So that company became Cochlear, and I wear a Cochlear product. There are about 2 to 3 major cochlear implant companies today. I would say Cochlear and Advanced Bionics have sort of a monopoly on the market right now, but Cochlear is essentially evolved out of the Graham Clark application. Next slide, please. So in 2007, you now have the rise of bilateral cochlear implants. That's a relatively new modern phenomenon. A lot of researchers initially were skeptical about the possibility of implanting both sides. They weren't sure how the brain was going to handle information from 2 sides, but it's actually considered sort of the next wave or the new wave of cochlear implantation protocol. So now we have 24 channels. We have incredible miniaturization. You can see how much the device has already shrunk. So these 2 are the most recent devices from Cochlear on the screen that you see there. One of them is a behind the ear, and one of them is simply a tiny little disc that, well, I wouldn't say tiny, but pretty small little disc that sits where your magnet would sit. And that is essentially wireless. Now, when I saw that come out, I was pretty stoked because that had been what I was waiting for a really long time. But I'm not sure I'm actually going to go with that device because it's pretty bulky. It can fall off my head pretty easily, and it doesn't have quite as advanced battery life and technological capabilities. So now you can start to see what's available on the market today. Okay. So I thought maybe we would do the demo of what it actually sounds like to listen to. If you want to go back, there's a link. So in this demo, it's going to move us through the different a single channel to multiple channels, so you can actually hear the experience of what it is like to listen to both music and a spoken phrase. So I wanted to ask you guys, as you listen, to think about which particular moment you can actually begin to understand or comprehend either what the song is or what the phrase is. I think you're going to need to turn the volume down.
What kind of bait do you use to catch them? What kind of bait do you use to catch them? What kind of bait do you use to catch them?
That was the last one. Okay, I'm interested in hearing your reactions. Was anyone able to identify the song or the phrase at a stage earlier than the final iteration? Did anyone actually know what the song was, out of curiosity? Any guesses? I have no idea. I'm sorry. I wish I had an answer for you. But I think that really illustrates, what I would say that demo illustrates is what it would sound like to start listening with a cochlear implant from the first day to maybe after a years of listening to the implant. So that last one sounds like what I hear, but again, that's kind of a meta thing to say because I'm listening to a cochlear implant simulation with a cochlear implant. So I think that it's pretty staggering to see what a brain can do with that amount of information and the gaps that it can fill. And that is essentially what I wanted you to take away. And that's why the cochlear implant is such a powerful tool for people with hearing loss. How much more time do you have before Q&A? 10 minutes? So let's move to the next slide now. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to introduce Mara Mills here. She is a historian of science and technology, and her work is really helpful for us because she covers or offers two valuable historical strands for thinking about the design and the function of cochlear implants. So that's normalization versus enhancement, okay? So you may have talked a little bit about this tension in your class up until this point, but in my mind, this is where assistive technology is poised on the cusp of moving from normalization to an enhancement. And I'm not necessarily suggesting sort of this utopian picture of technology, but I do want to suggest that the way we think about technology and disabled bodies is changing pretty significantly and pretty quickly at this point in time. So for these two strands, this idea of enhancement was actually proposed by Jack Steele in 1958 to describe the engineering of biological systems. And this is where the term bionics comes from, right? So also this idea of where the cyborg comes from, right? We think of the cyborg, which is a human-machine interface or system, as becoming more than what was given, right? So that's one sort of narrative that we see about cochlear implants, that maybe one day someone is going to be able to hear better than those with hearing. And that's actually one of the quotes that I wanted to share from Michael Kors, which she says, while my friends, I think if you could actually go back to a few slides, I don't have it off the top of my head. One more. Okay, my apologies. Keep going. Almost there. Okay. So my hearing is no longer limited by the physical circumstances of my body. While my friends' ears will inevitably decline with age, mine will only get better. So that is the enhancement narrative, right? That essentially one is disabled if they do not have assistive technology or any sort of technology. So that's one kind of narrative framework that we have. The second one is normalization. And this was the idea that the cochlear implant or any sort of hearing device could help a listener or a user with hearing loss reach or attain some level of being able to hear or communicate or engage with the world in a way that would resemble those with hearing, okay? So we already start to see this tension between enhancement and normalization. Okay, next slide, please. So again, what I wanted to explore is the rhetoric of cochlear implants through a few different communities. So we have the deaf community, we have the medical community, we also have a community called the deaf futurists, who I'll talk a little bit about as well. So up until the 20th century, the emphasis on treating hearing loss and other disabilities was on normalization, right? Using a hearing aid or a cochlear implant to correct or fix a hearing healing a body that could not or did not have the ability to heal fully. Okay, but disability study scholars expose the problems with that particular model. They said that it essentially had a negative impact on the deaf community. So there was a very vibrant community and culture called the deaf community, and this particular community communicates through sign language. They often eschew any sort of hearing devices or implants, although that is gradually changing. So they really value a world of silence, and they really value sign language. And they would argue against the cochlear implant as a device that's necessary because they get by just fine. So that is one narrative that we need to keep in mind. But in the 1950s and the 1960s, we see a shift towards enhancement with better technology, with miniaturized technology, with the rise of cybernetics. And so we start to think about technologies for those with disability as something that can do more, can provide more than just what the human body can. Okay, so to revisit deaf culture, so the argument made by those within the deaf culture is that the cochlear implant promotes what they call deaficide, which is essentially a form of language death. So the argument made within the deaf community is that the cochlear implants would eradicate the need to speak American Sign Language and eradicate all the wonderful nuances of deaf culture. There was even a documentary called The Sound and the Fury. I would really recommend it, that captures this counter rhetoric, and it highlights the deaf culture's discomfort, really resistance to cochlear implants because it treats deafness as a disability. I think most of us, I would even say I identify as someone with a disability, even though I'm also deaf. But that's an unusual relationship. Those within the deaf culture would say, my deafness is not a disability, it's just part of who I am. It's a part of my language. And then the other sort of argument made against cochlear implants is that it undercuts the value of nonverbal communication and the value of silence too. So that rhetoric is still very much prevalent today in the deaf community, but is, I think, gradually shifting to accommodate a more sort of spectrum or varied perspective of assistive technology. So then another narrative that we see about the cochlear implants is from a bioethical perspective. So it raises questions about the value of neuroenhancement. So that this is what we call any sort of assistive technology or medical technology that is either intervention in the brain or in the nervous system, and also artificial prosthesis. So one question that bioethicists have raised is whether or not the cochlear implant might promote this idea of eugenics, right? That we're striving towards a perfect body that in reality doesn't exist, and that it promotes the medical eradication of deafness. Now, I have a pretty conflicted stance towards this because on the one hand, I opted into that, right? I said, yes, I want something that can help me heal a little bit better, but I also wrestled with, well, what does it mean to attain a device that is going to maybe change my identity a little bit and change how I feel about my deafness? So that's still kind of an ongoing relationship that I negotiate. Are we almost out of time?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm happy to stop here and
here's what we're going to do.
Okay.
For people who really have to leave now, this is your time to move out of here slowly. And those who want to stay for a few more minutes to finish up Lindsay's talk, you're welcome to do so. So if you need to go, now's the time. If you have time to stay, that's great too.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we can move into Q&A pretty quickly from here.
Yeah.
So I'll use this as an opportunity actually to just stop here and take additional questions because I do want to respect people's time. So if you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to take those at this point in time. Yeah.
Okay, I got in trouble for this question last year, so I'm going to restate it.
Okay.
Okay, so I know from family experience that sometimes the sons or daughters of a mother who has a speech impediment, sometimes though that impediment is copied by the daughter or son. And so I was wondering about your case.
So as I mentioned, I do have a son, and it's been really fun learning to listen to him and trying to decipher his own language. But to answer your question, he does not. He speaks as if any other child would, but what I have noticed is that he enunciates his words very, very clearly. And he also, when he wants to get my attention, will grab my face and turn it towards him because he knows that sometimes I'm not going to understand him if he's, talking to the wall and not to me. So that might be the case for some individuals, but I think because I've made the choice to situate him and engage him with other healing individuals, and I would like that to change and expose him to more individuals like myself, but that might be one reason why. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hi.
So you, when you opted in you were making a choice about which community to participate in.
Yeah.
And that, I can imagine, may have been partly due to your classroom educational placement as you were growing up. And I imagine partly perhaps due to the fact that you could become deaf when you were 4 years old. And I'm wondering how much ownership you have contributed to that choice.
That's a really excellent question. So I would say some combination of what you just laid out already. So I should clarify that for me, I was raised on the oral path from the get-go. That was my parents' decision, obviously. And a lot of that decision was informed by how well I was doing with my hearing aids, at the recommendation of also educators and medical professionals, and also because I was born with hearing and had speech already, so I was essentially building on that. So I always identified as part of what we call the oral deaf community. So in other words, a deaf community that uses oral communication to communicate rather than sign language. But I do wonder sometimes, if my parents had decided to not mainstream me, then I don't know if I would be here today in this particular capacity. But I have known several individuals who have opted into the deaf community at later stages of their life, so it's always available to one. But I think given my interests, my occupational interests, work-wise, I felt like I had more opportunities being able to communicate orally than vis-a-vis sign language. But I've had opportunities over the years. I've actually taken sign language classes, and I've picked it up in some form, but like any other language, one has to practice it. And so most of my friends and acquaintances tend to be like myself, other people with cochlear implants. And so in that way, those sort of micro communities, you have a deaf community, you have the oral deaf community, and then you also have a community of cochlear implant users. So you tend to gravitate towards people who are most like yourself. But yes, I have grappled with questions of identity, and I had one really interesting experience when I was in college, and I participated in an event called the Deaf Olympics, which is essentially the Olympics for the deaf community. And in order to participate in the Deaf Olympics, I had to qualify and demonstrate that I had a certain degree of hearing loss. But I was the only one of my team members on the soccer team other than one other individual that had cochlear implants, and that was all. Everyone else spoke sign language. And so I was an outsider in that community, and I had to really reflect, and it was a really humbling experience, and I really began to sort of see the beauty of deaf culture in that way. Yeah. Yeah, I did.
How is this affected by shocks? Like, for example, you get
Yeah.
stuff, does it have any impact?
Yeah, my poor mother was like, don't have the ball. Whatever you do not have the ball. But I was like, I can't play the game. And I had a lot of conversations with my surgeon about this, and he said, you can do it. You have kids, little kids hitting their heads all the time. It was really scary the first time I headed the ball after I got my implant, and it actually kind of hurt a little bit. But I played 4 years of college soccer, and I didn't try to head the ball at every occasion that I could, but it was part of my repertoire. The bigger issue for me was getting my cochlear implant to stay on my head. As a woman, I could put my hair back and hold it that way, but there was one time when I headed the ball and my cochlear implant went flying to the glass, and it was in the middle of a college game, and all of a sudden I'm stopped and I'm looking for it. And my coach was like, what is she doing? And I managed to find it before someone stepped on it. But what I learned from that was, from then on, I wore pre-wrap, which was essentially a headband over my cochlear implant so that it would not fall off my head again. So I found my own adaptations with the cochlear implant. I had some issues with sweat, just deteriorating my device. I played in a very humid climate during on the East Coast, and so I would sweat so much that I would essentially destroy my implant. So I went through a couple of different devices in my freshman year until I figured out how to manage that. Yeah, question?
So, students generally get used to changes, like they always adopt different things. So, I was wondering if you're like happiness or other people in like the deaf community that then like get implants and can now hear, if their happiness like always increases, or if it's something that you just get used to, or like what's like the moment to moment kind of experience of like your state of mind? Does it make a huge difference, or is it you just do have broken ears?
So I feel like I can only answer that on an individual level because I think it really varies from person to person. So what is my level of happiness with the device? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
With the device itself, or just with life and hearing?
Yeah, like the, with hearing.
With hearing, okay.
Particular to the device.
Yes.
But do you think you'd be way less happy and like less content without it?
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. My level of happiness with what I'm hearing is really high. What the cochlear implant has given me is the ability to talk on the telephone, which I did not have before the cochlear implant. Granted, that's still a bit of a tenuous situation for me at times, but it just opens up a lot of opportunities for me. It makes me feel more empowered. It makes me... It's really hard to put into words, but I am really pleased with it. There are times when I get frustrated, to be sure, but most of those are technical challenges that I'm having with my device, but I can always go back and work with my audiologist or the company to fix those. There have been a few circumstances where one particular device, maybe I just never quite synced with it. I think I'm kind of having that experience right now, but I think it has more to do with the actual map or program that I have in my implant. So it takes a lot of tinkering and a lot of patience. Sometimes everything's working great, sometimes things don't work as great. But it's just part of the experience now, and that cost benefit is completely worth it in my mind. Yeah, question in the back?
I know you said before you kind of adapt
Yeah.
over time to understand the sound, but how much work did you
Yeah, so a lot of work. Especially the first cochlear implant that I got, I had to, let's see if I can remember. So I essentially met with an auditory therapist every week for the first few months. and she would give me exercises to take home, and I would work on that with my family. And so weekly appointments with an hour long, maybe longer, with someone trained specifically for helping users of cochlear implants to get up to speed with their device. And then from there on out, it was maybe once a month. But it took me essentially 4 to 5, maybe closer to 6 months to feel like I could actually appreciate what I was hearing and not cringe or recoil at the sound. And then I would say it took me probably about a year till I was really flying. But the interesting thing is when I got the second implant, even though I had not done anything to stimulate that ear for close to 10 years, I actually got up to speed really quickly with that. And my audiologist and the medical team did not know what to expect. They thought it was actually going to be harder for me. But because I think my brain had already been through that process, those sort of pathways had been carved out, and so I was able to catch on much more quickly. And so that experience the barrier was much lower for me the second time around. Yes. Yeah.
That first sound that we heard versus the last one in each of the different situations. That was over the course of a year, you said?
So I essentially said that's kind of what it felt like for me over the course of the year, but that demo was actually, I think, 1 or 2 frequencies versus 24 frequencies or electrodes. And then the last one was what it would sound like to everyone else. So the demo was meant to illustrate the richness of sound across how many electrodes you have, but I would say an analog is what it would sound like when someone is first listening to the implant versus one who had been listening for much longer. Does that make sense? Patience, a lot of patience, frustration. There was virtually no comprehension in the beginning. But your brain is really good at recognizing patterns and intonations. And so it's like putting together a puzzle. So if you're given a word, you're not going to be able to pick that up. But if you're giving it a sentence, the more information you get, the more you can kind of put together the puzzle. So I had to do a lot of puzzling out and pattern recognition as part of like my listening process. Hi.
I was wondering, does the device that's implanted, like under the spot, does it ever need maintenance, or do you think that does doctors say it's still there?
So that's a little bit unanswered right now. It's designed to last for a lifetime, but the reality is they're not sure yet because, as I said, cochlear implants, we're now seeing the first generation individuals, obviously, they either may not be with us anymore or they have moved on to multi-channel devices. I would say in the last 10 years, the internal devices are really built to last. From my knowledge, I've only known of one of my friends who had to get an upgrade of the internal device, but that was due to inner ear formation that she had and not because of like a device failure. I have friends who were implanted far earlier than me, and they're just kind of waiting at this point for the device to fail. And that's actually one of the reasons why I got the second implant, because I just didn't know what was going to happen with the first one or how long it would last. I expect at some point in my lifetime I'll get an upgrade, whether it's because of device failure or because the new technology is significantly better. Yeah.
See, right now you shared that there's 24 electrons.
24 electrodes in this string, yeah.
So what's the future hold for that?
I think more electrodes, smaller electrode thread, essentially, so they can fit more miniaturization, essentially, is the future. I think the future might be a fully implantable implant. I don't know exactly what that would look like because you still need like external input or access to sound. So maybe that comes through the ear rather than a microphone. So I think that might, I don't know if I'll see that in my lifetime, a fully implantable device, but I think that we will see smaller and smaller and smaller devices, just simply that might sit on the scalp. Devices that can be powered over a longer period of time. So right now I have a fairly short battery life, 1 to 2 days with a rechargeable. If I could wear it for days without having to recharge it, that would be great. More sophisticated technology and algorithms that do a better job of modulating environments and honing in on a speaker. I think they've come a long way in that, but sometimes to me, to my ear, it feels like I don't have a choice in what I'm listening to, and I personally don't think the technology is there yet to actually help me, but some people do really well with it. With the sort of on-the-fly, computerized switching to help elevate or enhance the sensory experience. And then, finally, Michael Kors, who I mentioned, says that we're going to be able to connect to the internet with a cochlear implant, which I think is a little bit outlandish, but you never know. Okay. Yeah.
You said that nowadays the kids up to 6 months, they get implanted.
Yes.
But how fast do they have to change the implants? How often do they have to change for the growth of the
So the internal or the external device?
internal?
So how fast do we have to change the internal device? So that the pacing of that is slower because that is more subject to FDA approval because it's a surgical device. So I think, let's see, since I was implanted, I think maybe a new internal device comes on the market every 5 to 6 years. So it might be a little slower than an external device which comes to market anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Did that answer your question? Yeah. So I think whenever someone is deemed eligible to get a cochlear implant, they receive the most current version. But sometimes there are instances, like I have 2 different internal devices because there was 10 years in between.
Is there a size difference if you're a child for the cochlear implant versus an adult? Just like the same and they just grow into it?
Oh, the size. Yeah, I think so. I think it's the same. I'm not a doctor, but I think the internal structure of the ear is pretty much intact. I don't know, maybe you can speak to that roughly, somewhat. If you have a doctor in the house, that's why I'm pointing to you. So I think yes, it's the same device. They don't have like an infant size cochlear implant, but yeah, the external device gets a little bit bulky for babies, and so they have to use some extra contraptions to kind of keep it secured on their head, especially like if you're a toddler, very active toddler, but kids manage really well with it. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lindsay. Let's see. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.